Hello and welcome to Fitel's Professional Services Programme, number 3, December 1989. This month we'll bring you the second part in our series on capital gains tax. In particular, we'll examine the tax as it applies to business transactions. And the man every accountant would love to interrogate is, of course, the Taxation Commissioner, Trevor Boucher. Well, unfortunately, that's not possible, so we've done it for you. An extensive interview with the Commissioner, conducted by accountants, will make a special program which will come to you next month, January 1990. This month we'll bring you a sample of what you can expect. And research and development. Both the state and federal governments provide funds for R&D, but who gets it? How do you go about applying for it? And what are the pitfalls?
Turnover isn't high enough yet to allow us to change the gear over. And the economy the way it is, we can't afford to take a punt.
I'm not saying you have to. Let us work on this gear. I'm sure we could modify it to get the job done if we could just have a little time and money.
Last month we began our look at capital gains tax by discussing one of the major exclusions to the tax, the family home. We showed examples of where the home could lose its exemption. This month we're going to look at assets which are subject to the tax. In particular, we'll examine capital gains tax as it applies to business-related transactions. Here's Jessica Klingender.
In the 1987-88 financial year, Australian companies paid over $155 million in capital gains tax. And there are millions more tax dollars which will be collected when currently owned business assets are eventually sold. The Liberals are talking about abolishing capital gains tax, but many experts think they can't afford to. There's just too much money involved. Whether or not a Liberal government would abolish the tax, for the moment it's here to stay. It affects the day-to-day running of business in all sorts of ways. Assets which are subject to capital gains tax include leases, licences, units in unit trusts, shares in companies and the rights to acquire shares, convertible notes, options, and amounts received in consideration for restrictive covenants, exclusive trade agreements, and variations in contracts.
The basic rule of capital gains tax is that any gain made on the disposal of an included asset will be taxable at the taxpayer's marginal rate. Any capital loss will be deductible, but only against a capital gain. Now, if you don't have a capital gain in the particular year of income, then the loss can be carried forward and offset against gains of later years. When you're assessing your capital gains tax liability, you must ask, when was the asset acquired and when was it disposed of? What consideration was received for the asset? When should the tax be paid? And, of course, how much tax do you owe? We're going to look at each of those elements separately. For capital gains tax purposes, the words acquisition and disposal don't just mean the buying or selling of an asset. They mean any form of change in ownership. For example, if an asset's created, say an artist paints a painting, then it's seen as having been acquired, and if that asset is lost or destroyed, then it will be regarded as having been disposed of. Now, for most transactions, the date of acquisition or disposal is fairly straightforward, but with capital gains tax, you've always got to look at how the asset was acquired or disposed of.
If there's a contract, the date of acquisition or disposal is the time the contract is made. Generally, this is the date of the contract. Otherwise, it's the date ownership changed. That's not always easy to determine, as Michael O'Shannessy, Principal Advising Officer at the Victorian Taxation Office, explains.
The time of making of the contract is usually the date written on the contract. However, there are some exceptions to this. In the case of land, it's the exchange of contracts. In the case of a condition precedent, and that condition precedent goes to the existence of the contract, and that condition is not met, then the date written on the contract is irrelevant for capital gains tax purposes.
When assets are constructed or created, otherwise than under a contract, the time of acquisition of the asset is the time construction started, or the time the asset was created.
The Commissioner has issued two rulings in relation to the time of creation of an asset. The first is in relation to goodwill, and that will be when the business first commenced. In relation to a patent, the time of creation of the asset will be when the research and development first commenced.
When assets are lost or destroyed, the date of disposal is either the date on which compensation is received, or if there's no compensation, then the date the loss was discovered or destruction occurred. In the case of compulsory acquisition, the time of disposal will be the earliest of the following dates: the date compensation was received, the date the person or authority acquiring the asset became the owner, the date the person or authority acquiring the asset legally entered the asset, say land, or the date the person or authority takes possession of the asset. When payment for an asset is made by instalments, the disposal date is calculated by applying those rules. Let's take an example. Say Jean-Pierre buys a French restaurant in 1986 for $150,000. 2 years later, in 1988, he sells the restaurant for $250,000. $100,000 is paid when the contract's signed, and the rest of the money is receivable over the next 4 years in instalments. Now, Jean-Pierre would have been smarter to demand all of the money at the time the restaurant was sold. His capital gains tax liability will be calculated on the basis that he received the full $250,000 in 1988, and it will be payable in that financial year. That's because the restaurant, the asset, was disposed of at the time the contract was made, and capital gains tax liability arises then, regardless of when the money is actually received.
The vendor could suffer financial strain in this situation. For the purchaser, he will get the benefit of indexation from the date he is liable to pay it, the purchase price. He mightn't have paid the full purchase price, but he still gets the benefit of the indexation.
Having worked out the relevant date, the next thing to determine is the consideration paid or received. While that's simple if it's just money, it becomes a bit more complicated when part or all of the consideration is shares or other assets. When this happens, you must determine the market value of the consideration. If that's impossible, or there's no consideration, tax is assessed using the market value of the asset. If, for example, you buy a block of land in exchange for shares worth $20,000, then obviously the consideration is the market value of the shares. But if instead of shares, you gave the landowner an undertaking to marry his ugly son, the consideration would be the market value of the land. Once you've worked out what is assessable, the next question is, when are taxes payable? Payment is usually due in the tax year the gain was made, but rollover relief is available in a number of circumstances. The first situation in which a taxpayer may defer capital gains tax liability is where there has been an involuntary disposal. That's where an asset is lost, destroyed, damaged, or compulsorily acquired. When this happens, a taxpayer can elect to defer tax if compensation or insurance is either used to replace the asset, or a replacement asset is provided, or capital expenditure is used to have the original asset repaired or restored. If the taxpayer wants deferral to apply, he or she must notify the Commissioner in writing on or before the date of lodgement of the income tax return in the year of income in which the disposal takes place. If the replacement asset represents an original asset bought before 20th of September 1985, then it will keep that pre-1985 status. But if the consideration paid for the new asset is 20% or more than the market value of the original asset, it will lose that status. The replacement asset must be used in the same business or put to the same or similar use as the one it's replacing. Say Farmer Joe has a 200-hectare sheep farm that he's owned for 40 years. Its current value is $400,000. The government compulsorily acquires 100 hectares to build an airport, and Joe's paid $200,000 in compensation. He decides to get out of farming and buys a delicatessen in town for $190,000. As required by law, Joe notifies the tax office in writing of his wish to defer his tax in the income year he receives the compensation. Sadly for Joe, any gain he might make when he sells the deli will be taxable. The reason? Because he used the money to buy a totally different asset from the one it was meant to replace. If he'd bought more land for farming and later sold it for a profit, there would be no tax payable, as the new land would be treated as having been bought pre-1985. Rollover relief is also available for some forms of business reorganisation. Even though the paperwork may show that assets have been transferred, a disposal under the capital gains rules, if beneficial ownership doesn't change, then liability can be deferred. Broadly, tax deferral is available when assets are transferred to a wholly owned company or between companies in the same group, shares are exchanged in the same company or same unit trust, all the shares in a unit trust are exchanged for all the shares in a company, shares in an existing company are exchanged for shares in an interposed company. As an example, let's look at the specific rules applying to the transfer of assets to a wholly owned company. Fred and John carry on a plumbing business. Over the years, they've acquired a fair amount of assets.
Just let me get this straight. You two want to form a company and transfer all your business assets to that company, is that correct?
Yeah, well, we've weighed up the pros and cons, and we reckon it's time we set up as a company.
But we've heard that if we transfer the assets, we could be up for capital gains tax.
Well, that's right. Technically, the transfer of an asset is seen as disposal, but you may be able to roll over benefit if you meet some requirements. And you're both Australian residents?
Yeah.
And they're taxable Australian assets?
Yeah, sure.
Right. You're not a charity, so the company won't be exempt from tax.
Yes, no, you bet it won't. Anyway, doesn't charity begin at home?
I hope so.
Now, if you want the deferral, you have to make sure that the assets transferred to the company are in exchange for shares or securities in that company. If you receive any money consideration or anything else from the company, you won't be able to defer.
What about these shares? Who else can have shares?
Well, no one. They must be owned wholly by yourselves, or beneficially in proportion to the assets previously owned.
Does that include assets bought before September 85?
Well, it can, if you want them transferred. It just means that further down the track, in say 12 months' time, if you want to sell the shares, then those shares exchanged for assets purchased prior to the 20th of September 1985 will be tax-free, but the shares received in exchange for the assets purchased after that date will be subject to capital gains. Now, it'll be assumed that those shares were purchased at the asset's cost base.
In the August budget, the Treasurer proposed limiting the permissible consideration to shares in the company and assumption of any liabilities attributable to the asset. The liabilities assumed will have to be less than the cost base or market value of the transferred asset. It's also proposed that the market value of the shares must equal the net market value of the transferred asset. These changes, if introduced, will apply to all assets transferred after the 15th of August 1989. Deferral of tax liability is also available where assets are transferred between companies in the same group. Let's see what might happen if Fred and John had already set up another company.
Some of our assets are already owned by a company we set up some time ago. Could that be a problem?
Not as long as both companies are owned by the same people. You. For a full income year or from the creation of the new company. Now, as long as you comply with all the conditions that I've mentioned, you'll be able to defer liability. But the difference is, in this situation, the new company will be able to give to the old company cash, shares, debt, or any other asset as consideration for the transfer. And if you do want to defer liability, then both companies will need to inform the tax office.
So we're not restricted in the kind of returns we get for the assets we transfer?
That's pretty much the case. And the consideration doesn't have to equal the cost base of the asset transferred to the company.
So what's to stop our company selling my ute to the new company for $200,000 cash?
Well, nothing at present, except Part 4A, the general anti-avoidance provisions. But there were changes proposed in the August budget.
And what happens if they go through?
Well, the new company will be restricted to two things. One, giving the old company shares, and two, assuming any liabilities attaching to the transferred assets. Now, those liabilities will have to be less than the cost base or market value of the assets. It's also proposed that the market value of the shares must equal the assets' market value.
The budget changes will allow consideration to take the form of securities when a transfer of shares would be against the law. For example, where a subsidiary company is prohibited by company law from holding shares in its parent. In addition, the proposals would allow deferral where a subsidiary within a wholly owned group distributes an asset in specie to its parent company.
As we mentioned earlier, deferral is also available for other kinds of business reorganisation. These include exchanging shares in the same company and units in the same unit trust, or interposing a company between a unit trust and unit holders, or an existing company and its members. Now, while the specific prerequisites for deferral do change according to the type of reorganisation, there are basic principles which apply across the board.
Basically, there are four preconditions. The first would be that the asset has to be a taxable Australian asset, and also the transferor or transferee should be an Australian resident. The second one is that the consideration should be the only consideration received, and also that the value of that in most cases should equal the asset being transferred. The third one would be that the particular people or entities should take the same proportion as they had held previously in the new entity, be it shares or units. And finally, the entities have to notify the Commissioner in their next return of that they wish to defer.
In all cases, the basic requirement is that as long as the underlying ownership of the assets being transferred has remained constant, then deferral will be available, even if the nature of the asset or the structure through which it's held has changed. But in each case, you should check the relevant sections of the Tax Act to make sure that all the requirements for each type of business reorganisation are met.
If deferral is available and the preconditions are met, then any shares or units that are acquired that represent pre-85 assets will maintain that status, and any shares or units that represent post-85 assets will have a cost base of the original assets that have been transferred.
Once you've worked out if and when capital gains tax liability arises, the next question, and the one your client is probably most interested in, is how much tax is payable.
As we pointed out in our previous segment on capital gains tax in November, the cost base of an asset is the total of the following costs: the cost of buying the asset, incidental acquisition and disposal costs, capital costs to maintain a right over or title to the asset, and the cost of capital improvements made to the asset. And if the asset has been held for more than 12 months, the cost base will be CPI indexed.
The main points to remember. Capital gains tax liability arises on the disposal of a taxable asset. The date of acquisition or disposal of an asset is the date of the relevant contract. If there's no contract, it's the date of ownership change. To determine what consideration was paid, you must find the market value of the consideration. If that's not possible, look at the market value of the asset. There is no capital gains tax payable on the involuntary disposal of assets. There will be no liability to pay tax on the acquisition or disposal of an asset brought about by a business reorganization as long as beneficial ownership of the relevant asset doesn't change. Generally speaking, the previous owners of the asset, shares, units, or whatever, must own the assets of the new entity in the same proportion as they held the transferred assets. They must receive no other consideration for the transfer. In some cases, the value of the consideration must equal the value of the transferred units, shares, or assets. Changes proposed in the August budget, if passed, would ensure that this requirement applies across the board. There must be no new owners introduced. the new entity will usually have to elect to have the deferral apply. And remember, as with other provisions of the tax laws, residency provisions must be met before the deferral rules will apply.
Next month, we'll bring you a special edition of Fitel Professional Services, which will be mainly taken up with an extensive interview with the Commissioner of Taxation, Trevor Boucher. It's not an interview by journalists or even by specialist financial writers. The Commissioner has been questioned by accountants, asking the questions that accountants want answered. The interview was recorded at the Institute of Chartered Accountants office in Sydney, and we'd like to thank the Institute for the assistance it provided. On the interview panel with me were Ron Crowe, a partner with Ernst & Young, and Michael Watson from the Watson & Proud accounting firm in Parramatta. As I said, the extended version of this interview will come to you next month, but here's some of what you can expect.
But in general inquiries where you ask for an opinion in writing from the Australian Taxation Office, so there's no doubt that that you might not be doing the right thing completely. I've found from my experience as a small practitioner that the answers tend to be quite evasive, or they say, they start off with a paragraph typically saying, you'd appreciate that the Commissioner cannot be bound to the following opinion, but here's what it is.
Yeah, well, there is that paragraph, and the Senate committee that looked at the ruling system indicated why that needed to be there. But as you know, ruling 2500 indicates very clearly that we stand by the general rulings we give, we stand by them generally. The individual expressions of opinion, we stand by them in relation to the particular case. That's the reality. I don't know whether evasive is the word in terms of our response to that. I would expect that our people responding to the information that's in front of them give us full and complete answers as they can in the circumstances.
But with rulings, don't you feel that, I mean, from a practitioner's perspective, and I guess from general public's perspective, rulings are perceived as something that's law now. It's always written into a ruling that it's not law and it's the view of the tax office, but the profile comes across that it is the law, and it's taken up in the media that way. And I guess what I'd like to see from the tax office perspective is a change of attitude. I'm not saying criticism, but at least a change of attitude so that people can get the impression that it's not the law. It's your opinion.
Well, the rulings themselves indicate on their face that they're not the law, and you as practitioners would realise that. I suppose there's a question of what's the alternative, but see, we have to get consistency around the country in our interpretation, and obviously there'd be trouble if to the extent we didn't do that. What's the technique by which we aim for consistency? And that is through our rulings to state a general position.
Yes.
So in that sense, we'd expect our staff to follow them. Now, in areas where it's not black and white, and I guess a lot of areas aren't black and white, sure, those rulings aren't wholly writ.
Could I just bring you back to something we were discussing before, which was the one-page, I guess, corporate tax return. As a practitioner, I guess, I worry about my liability that will come under that regime, mainly from the perspective of the amount of information that I give via the tax return and my sign-off of that tax return. And also from a client's perspective, their concern must be that they won't be able to supply the right amount of information. So where I'm coming from is I'm a little bit wary of that, and I can't see how we're going to cut down on the amount of information we actually have clients prepare. So I think it's maybe not going to work out the way people think it does.
Yeah, well, certainly, as we're seeing it, the volume of information that comes into us is, as I say, drastically reduced. I think there's benefits all round in that. The amendment period is to be brought back from 6 to 4 years. So,
can you understand my concern? I mean, here I am, you've got a client who's preparing a tax return. They might have prepared reams in the past to fill out a tax return, and now they're not doing that. They've got proposed this one-pager. And then somebody comes along and does an audit of them. All of a sudden, they're running for cover. because they won't have the amount of detail that they're used to preparing. And as a practitioner, I'd be concerned that they didn't have it.
But yes, it's part of the system is that the full detail to support the shorter return is held by the taxpayer. So the taxpayer has got the ability at the time of preparing the return to record in as full a detail as it wishes what it is that may come under review at a later stage.
Yeah, but there's a lot of questions that are asked.
Yeah. Well, there's a facility for handling that, isn't there, already, and that's going to be reviewed as part of the overall implementation of the system.
I guess I'd just like more consideration to be given to it, because I really am concerned about taxpayers who will feel an obligation maybe to keep more information than they otherwise would have. This is, again, there's this fear thing.
As I think I indicated earlier, what's been unveiled has come out of consultation with practitioners. Maybe not everything there is exactly as they'd have wished it, but there has been that process. And the government indicated in the Parliament just recently that we are continuing consulting with business and professional groups to look at all the questions surrounding the self-assessment system to make it work better.
Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Have you got any view as to how you feel about a taxpayer's Bill of Rights, as opposed to what's already in the Act, of course?
I suppose my short response is why? Why have it? There is one in the United States, and what's Bill of Rights mean anyway? I mean, there's no... We can talk about it, but you'd need to look at what the components are.
Taxpayers' rights might be more fitting the bill.
Yeah. But when you go into the history of it in the United States, it's a history quite unlike, a base starting point, if you like, quite different to the one we're in, because there were concerns expressed over there about particular instances. The Bill of Rights, as it's emerged there, addressed those things. Under our law, those same things couldn't occur here.
If you got to the unfortunate situation where you're into an appeal situation, the appeal fee went from $2 to $200 to $300, and there seems to have been a higher than proportionate dropping down as the fee went higher. Less and less people are appealing. Is this really in the discriminatory nature of the fee, in your opinion, or is it cut out the frivolous references?
Well, there are government decisions reflected in that fee level, and I'm not going to comment on the rightness or otherwise of that.
That's right, but a taxpayer for a tool allowance has got to pay $300, and BHP for some quite complicated matter has got to pay $300. It can't be fair under a taxpayer's rights and that both get treated the same way.
If it gets through to that stage, but one of the things that we've introduced within the tax office, and only yesterday I was being complimented by a leading lawyer as to the way in which this procedure operates, and that is we strenuously aim for an independent internal review of basic decisions that are made. So an assessment is made, taxpayer objects, there's an independent review of that, and that's a way of addressing that and making sure that a taxpayer is not needlessly put to the expense of taking it into the AAT.
Mr Boucher, can we just turn briefly to access guidelines, the access to accountants' working papers? Haven't you given in virtually to the accountants? What do you, the tax man, get in return?
No, we haven't given in. We've certainly, by those guidelines, addressed some matters that I know have been of intense concern to accountants for some time. The point they make to me is that they're a key part of the tax system. That's a very valid point. Self-assessment depends on their input into the overall process, and for self-assessment to work effectively, there was a range of accountants' papers that in the ordinary circumstance should not be accessed by it. Now, we've agreed to that, met their concerns. At the same time, I guess I'd mention the government has announced in the budget that audit and other compliance costs will be tax deductible. What do I get in return? I confidently expect that those matters of key concern to accountants having been addressed in those ways, the levels of cooperation that we have received will be enhanced. There'll be better levels of cooperation and indeed at the taxpayer level, better levels of compliance.
A fair trade-off, Ron Crowe?
Well, I suppose from a practitioner's point of view, I'd really ask why didn't you go the one step further, which is to give accountants the same privilege as lawyers for the purposes of the Income Tax Assessment Act?
Well, what we've agreed, and I emphasise we have agreed with the accountancy bodies, takes as a background the legal privilege.
My understanding was that you were pretty strong on the fact that you wouldn't give privilege.
Well, you look at the guidelines, that the access guidelines have been developed, and I've understood that people are pretty satisfied with them. There's a line of demarcation there between source documents and non-source documents. We do need to get at the bottom of things, and I think that the outcome is a pretty fair deal.
The full version of that interview will be part of Programme 4, January 1990. This month we're introducing a new segment to our professional services program, Tax Updates. Each month we'll bring you the latest legislative changes, court rulings, access guidelines, etc. that affect the tax system. With our first update, here's Brendan Wood.
There have been several changes made to the tax laws in the past few weeks, although most of them are the results of announcements made in the August '89 budget. The most contentious, of course, and the one we'll concentrate on, concerns the new arrangements for the payment of company tax. You'll remember that in August the government announced that under the new system, companies would have to pay 85% of their notional tax within 15 days of the end of the year of income. Well, that caused an outcry from accounting and business circles. As a result, the government has made a few changes. The first is that the 15-day period has been extended to 28 days. The other change concerns companies with a notional tax of between $1,000 and $20,000. Companies within that range have been given a choice. They can go with the new system, that is 85% within 28 days and the remainder after 9 months, or they can opt to pay the whole liability in the 6th month after the year of income. The government is also allowing a transition period for companies with a liability of between $20,000 and $400,000. Now, at the top of that range, it equates to a taxable income of more than $1 million. For the first year, those companies can opt to ignore the 28-day rule and pay the full amount in the 6th month. But remember, that will only apply for the first year of operation. The other thing to come out of this change to company tax payments is that the government has agreed to have another look at the rules concerning loans used to pay company tax. Under the current system, there's no deductibility for interest on loans taken out solely for tax purposes. Well, after a lot of submissions from business and tax professionals, the government has agreed to review that rule, and the results of the review will be known shortly, and we'll keep you informed. Finally, the Australian Tax Office has released its own results for the 1988-89 year, and in purely business terms, it's doing very nicely, thank you. Last year, the ATO collected $69.3 billion in revenue. That was 15.2% up on the previous year, and more than $960 million more than the budget estimate. And the next time you feel like complaining about lazy public servants, remember that the revenue collected by the tax office per head of its own staff is now $4 million a year, and that's not bad productivity.
For most of us, tax deductions include basics like tools, equipment, trade journals, but for some taxpayers, deductions can be quite different. These are judged under ruling IT 297, which says that a deduction can be allowed if A, the clothing is necessary and peculiar to the taxpayer's occupation, or B, if clothing is otherwise conventional in nature, the taxpayer is required to incur abnormal expenditure due to occupation. Under the necessary and peculiar test, successful claims have included a black suit worn by a funeral director in tropical Queensland, bus driver's shoes, and shirts worn by television journalists. Not allowed have been solicitor's dark suit, taxi driver's white shirt, typist stockings, and nurse's flesh-coloured stockings.
Research and development. It's a business practice many Australian companies choose to ignore, either because they can't afford it or because they're happy to leave the spade work to overseas or local affiliates of competitors. When you compare the R&D performance levels in Australia with other nations, it's hardly likely to swell any true blue Aussie chest with pride. For example, the United States businesses invest 2% of the nation's GDP in research and development each year. West Germany and Sweden, both models of industrial efficiency, spend 1.8 and 1.5% respectively. Switzerland spends 1.7%. And Australia, well, here it's just 0.46 of 1%. If it makes you feel any better, Ireland comes in under us at 0.35%. Yet there are several government assistance schemes available in Australia for research and development. So is something wrong somewhere? Tony Porter has been investigating.
I know it's not your fault, Harry, but the equipment isn't that old. We shouldn't be having this many problems.
We stayed at previous production levels, we wouldn't have any problems at all, Mike. Look, you're asking us to cope with workloads they weren't designed to take.
Look, we're doing all right, but... turnover isn't high enough yet to allow us to change the gear over. And the economy the way it is, we can't afford to take a punt.
I'm not saying you have to. Let us work on this gear. I'm sure we could modify it to get the job done, if we could just have a little time and money.
Necessity, as we all know, is the mother of invention. But necessity doesn't always have money in her pockets to support her offspring.
Yeah, I can see what you're getting at, Tim. It's going to take a lot of development to get it into the plant.
Sure. What are we talking about? 6 months? A year at the most? And it could give us a jump on the others. Put us light years ahead.
If we could spare you, then we can do it.
Yeah, sure, I could do it.
On the other hand, sheer brilliance isn't enough either. Even the best ideas need a little work, a little research and development. That's where GERD, Grants for Industry Research and Development, and the Tax Concession Scheme for R&D come in.
But before you start advising clients to rush off and apply for some free government money, there are several questions that businesses should consider. What assistance is available? How do you get it? What is legitimate R&D expenditure? How much should you invest in R&D? What are the chances it'll pay off? And what, if any, are the catches? It's worth getting several perspectives on all of these questions, from the people with the ideas, the people with the money, and the people in between.
But first, a brief overview of the two main R&D support schemes. Companies like the ones we've just seen are pretty well set up, presumably profitable, and therefore in a perfect position to take advantage of the tax concessions. The concessions are straightforward enough on paper. A sliding scale applies to R&D expenditure from the 85-86 financial year right through until 94-95, and maybe beyond. If you incurred R&D expenditure between July 86 and June 93, you're eligible for a rebate of up to 150%. From July 93 to June 95, it'll drop to 125%, and thereafter most likely to 100%, although nobody's saying for sure. For less profitable concerns, those which can't afford to wait till the end of the year to claim a tax rebate, there's the GERD scheme. This allows grants up to half the company's R&D expenditure, although in some cases it may be as high as 90%. The funds can be released in stages in advance, but it's up to you to find the balance of the expenditure. That and the current squeeze on funds are the major hitches in the scheme. Ken Murley is one of many tax advisors in the industry who deal almost daily with the R&D schemes.
The biggest restriction on the GERD scheme is the amount of funds that are available under the government. Originally, before the 150% scheme came in, you had funding to the level of something like $70 million under the equivalent scheme. Now it dropped in the first year to somewhere around about 12 million. It's since gone up to about 40 million, and half of that is taken up by a section of the industry which the government have targeted as being the most likely to have success overseas and for which Australia to build their base on. So that only leaves maybe 20 million left for people in general industry to try and get what they can out of it.
But if you're just starting out, it seems you're on your own. Alex Graham's design for a hexagonal prefabricated building is, he says, a potential gold mine. cyclone and bushfire proof, it's ideal as a fire shelter for schools or remote work sites and can double as a multi-purpose room. It's also ideal as a dwelling for third world nations. Its shape and construction makes it highly adaptable. Alex has a swag of letters expressing interest, including a letter from the Victorian Education Department. But after applying for government support, all he's received is a letter saying his company is undercapitalised. In other words, too risky. Promises to buy, it seems, are not enough.
To this point in time, we've generated about $25 to $30 million worth of interest in what we've done.
If you can get that kind of interest, why can't you raise the money?
Beats me. You know, that's what we've been trying for the last 8 months to do, and everywhere we go in financing or sourcing finance from government institutions, we get the old story that you're undercapitalised, and it's the chicken and egg syndrome. Actually, something I got to see out of that is that basically financial institutions lend money, not to people.
Well, if you can't get the funding, what's the future?
Well, in 2 weeks' time, I'll be talking to a Japanese company who have representatives in Australia that have approached me about selling the technology to Japan. At the moment, I've financed the thing entirely on my own up to now. I can't afford to do that any longer. I have outstanding creditors that I have a commitment to paying back. My only avenue is to sell the technology off, and once again it becomes the same old story that happens to new and innovative ideas. It simply ends up in overseas hands.
As the people with the money readily admit, it's often a matter of juggling clever ideas, public money and commercial viability.
There are a lot of inventors in Australia, and Australia has a good background in being inventors. The problem is that you can't fund every project which comes along. Government money has to be targeted towards something which will give a return in the long run to Australia. And the backyard inventor receives quite a significant amount of support through state-run programs, innovation centres, and perhaps other programs within DITAC, such as the National Industry Extension Service, which allows him to develop into something more than your backyard part-time inventor. But the bottom line is that backyard inventors have the great ideas. They have to find someone who's able to bring that invention to fruition onto the marketplace, hopefully onto the export marketplace, to receive the benefits, I suppose.
Yet it would seem that the grant system is loaded against the individual, the little man.
You're right, Tony, it is. It's loaded towards a commercial outcome. Now, individuals do receive grants, but we look for the individual to find a commercial partner, someone who's able to bring expertise in terms of development, marketing, taking something from pre-production to production. It's, I suppose, becoming quite clear that you can't throw good money after bad. You have to start taking a more pragmatic approach. And in doing that, yes, the individual is probably less of a focus or less of a target for granting nowadays, but he's not excluded.
Confused? Well, maybe that's another reason why so many companies run a mile when somebody mentions research and development. Even if you can get funding, or if your company's in a position to be able to win tax concessions, there's still a lot to be done to get your idea into production. Not to mention the minefield of marketing.
Organisations like the Innovation Centre try to help inventors get R&D support, but that's only a small part of the battle.
If we look at it on a scale, if you're spending something like $100 on a prototype, you might be looking at spending something like $1,000 to get into the market. So there is a large gap, and that's where a lot of investment is required. We're finding that that type of investment is coming best from private investors who already are in that marketplace or in that technology or in that manufacturing area. So they have a lot of the infrastructure, and the cash required isn't as high. They can perhaps use some surplus capacity, and if we can link our clients who have a good idea with somebody who's already in that area, it might be, well, it often is an easier way into the market. And we're exploring ways of being able to use the GERD scheme, for example, to put some funding into that joint venture, if I can call it that.
This department is taking a lot more active role through things like the Industry Research and Development Board in trying to bring together a researcher and a commercial partner. Our international programs try to establish linkages between Australian small companies and overseas companies with vested interests. So that is happening more and more. Sometimes you have to find that market niche, and perhaps finding the market niche is using a multinational or an overseas company. Once you get runs on the board, it's easier to get into the market still. So yes, in the short term, it's not a great situation to be in. In the long term, it's setting the scene for, I suppose, international respect for Australia's ability to be innovative, to produce good quality manufactured products.
So perhaps the answer is to go out and tout for your own backers and be prepared to let go of your baby if necessary in order to see it grow. If you're determined to go for government money, there are guides available, such as Jane Ford's excellent book, available through mail order.
The book lists alternative schemes such as the National Procurement Development Programme. If you're struggling to develop and demonstrate a product against overseas competition, you may be eligible for up to half your project costs. Normally these costs should exceed $50,000, but smaller projects may be considered.
But the overriding impression one gets today is that money is tight, and this is, after all, a free enterprise society. So if your idea is good enough, go out and sell it.
Do people expect too much in the way of government support?
There is a tendency, I think, for people to look to the government to support development of new products. Whilst there certainly is a government responsibility, I don't think anybody, or most people don't make a lot of money out of waiting for government finance. It isn't the best way of getting into a commercial venture. I think if you look at some of the very successful companies who are developing new products, they have a minimum of government input in terms of finance.
Australians are very good at investing in exploration and investing in bricks and mortar, but in the end they're not really productive. Research and development has as many risks as exploration and as many risks as bricks and mortar, but no more. It's a different type of risk, but the benefits of investing in research are enhancing our productive capability. It enhances our workforce, our skills base, our exports, and in the end, our lifestyle.
So how do you turn that idea into a viable project? Like everything, pre-planning is the key to turning your concept into a profit. This will help you determine A, its market, B, viability, and C, if you need a grant. If you are able to cope without a grant, tax rebates are currently available for any R&D expenditure outlaid from 1985 to 1995. And while grant money is difficult to get, it's not impossible. Contact in the first instance can be made to the Department of Industry, Technology and Commerce in your state for information about some of the grants available. But guides, such as the SciTech Technology Directory, are available. These outline the types of grants available, what the criteria is, and who to contact.
Keeping fit is not just healthy, but it can provide you with some unexpected tax deductions. A professional football player instructed by his coach to play squash to keep fit was allowed the cost of doing so. And a dancer employed by a professional dance company was allowed a deduction for massage treatment to keep her in good shape and injury-free, as her physical fitness was an implied condition of employment. But an airline pilot was denied a deduction for a Get Fit course, even though he had failed his regular 6-monthly medical examination, meaning he would have lost his pilot's licence. A professional footballer was allowed the cost of buying extra food and drink because his coach had prescribed a special diet as a method of countering a rare weight loss condition. Among his deductions allowed were steak, beer, potatoes, and an energy drink.
And now, with the latest from the Fitel Information Centre, here's John Waters.
Richard, thank you. And from the Information Centre, some updates in regard to earlier segments in this program. First, capital gains. And in his second reading on the Taxation Laws Amendment Bill number 5, the Minister for Finance, Senator Walsh, said a related amendment will permit taxpayers to have amounts paid for professional advice concerning the impact of taxes on the acquisition or disposal of an asset included in the cost base used to calculate the taxpayer's capital gain or loss on the asset. These changes will apply to expenditure incurred on or after July the 1st, 1989. With regard to research and development, Senator Walsh also announced changes during his second reading of the Tax Amendment Bill number 4. The most significant changes include the company tax concession for industry investment in R&D has been extended. The 150% reduction will be extended to the 30th of June 1993, and the 125% reduction will operate until the 30th of June 1995. Also, expenditure on scientific research will now finish in 1995 instead of 1991. Companies receiving a government grant or recoupment for expenditure on research and development will no longer suffer a total loss of deduction entitlements. Instead, a formula is being introduced to reduce the deduction otherwise allowable by reference to the grant or recoupment. Companies will now be able to share plant and equipment used exclusively for research and development without putting their deductions in jeopardy. The government will not go ahead with the proposed changes regarding capital gains and intra-group research development activities, but will keep this area under review. In relation to Amendment Bill number 6, the bill proposes that a company acquiring or acquiring the right to use core technology only be able to claim a deduction at the reduced rate of 100% of the expenditure incurred. Where a reduction has been allowed or is allowable for expenditure on an R&D project, receipts from granting access to or the right to use the results of the project are to be included in assessable income. And finally, deductions at the rate of 150% are now available where all or some funds may be invested at less than full risk. The bill will reduce the deduction allowable proportionately from 150% to 100%, dependent on the element of risk. And just before I go, an important reference for those seeking research and development funds is the SciTech Technology Directory. The 1990 edition of the directory will be available from January the 15th, 1990. The book retails for $99 plus postage and is only available from SciTech Publications Proprietary Limited, 49 Boobiella Street, O'Connor in the ACT, or Post Office Box 1915, Canberra, ACT 2601. Don't forget that if you require any further information regarding Fitel, please don't hesitate to call us on our Fitel hotline 008 033 798. From all of us at the Fitel Information Centre, have a happy, safe and prosperous Christmas and New Year. Richard.
Thanks, John. In the past few months, Gwen Peters has looked at money-making schemes from around the world. Closer to home this month, she's been looking at a real growth area.
Everyone complains about modern productivity, but there's one thing we're producing faster and in greater quantities than ever before: garbage. The South Australian government doesn't see it as a problem. In fact, Premier John Bannon sees the Crow-Eaters' economic future in the trash can. With environmentally based economic initiatives, he wants to turn the festival state into the garbage tip of Australia. The world is crying out for ways of handling the ever-increasing mountains of rubbish. So Premier Bannon has introduced a policy of working with industry to develop commercially viable waste recycling ventures and to support the development of new technology for waste management. The state government sees it as a potential goldmine for both private industry and the state. Already planned for trial is a system for using sewerage effluent for irrigation, as well as technology to make toxic waste environmentally sound. And with supermarkets across the country turning to environmentally friendly products, there's no doubt that there's money to be made in being green.
Well, it sounds like a load of old rubbish to me, but that's it for Programme 3, December 1989. On behalf of all of us here at Fitel, I'd like to wish you all a wonderful Christmas and a very prosperous New Year. We'll be back next month with our special interview with the Commissioner of Taxation, Trevor Boucher. But until then, goodbye.